We're talking about suspension lifts on a first-gen Nissan Xterra today. This isn't going to be a how-to or a demonstration of installing a lift kit or anything like that, but this is going to be a nice overview if you're unfamiliar with suspension lifts and what are the components required to do a lift. One thing I want to go ahead and point out is that I do have some older videos, one on the three generic types of lift, being suspension lift, body lift, and then larger tires. I also have an older video on re-indexing torsion bars that talk a little bit about what a torsion bar is and how to re-index it. That'll be relevant to when you get into suspension lifts with control arms. I also have some other older videos that are talking about heavy-duty steering systems and lifted alignments, because once you do a suspension lift, that is going to put more stress on your steering components. It's going to increase the angle of your tie rods, and you got to have a plan to reinforce those weak points in the Nissan Xterra. So the first gen Nissan Xterra has an independent front suspension, which means that you have your frame rails that go outward, and then you're going to have control arms that stick out to the left and stick out to the right on both the driver and passenger side. That means that your left front tire and your right front tire are not solidly connected by a solid axle underneath. That has some benefits, very few. Most of it is going to be on-road characteristics. It absorbs bumps very well. But also, when you do a suspension lift, it also gives you more frame clearance than you would if you had a solid axle in the front, because the solid axle will go straight across and your front differential is going to be the lowest point. But when you droop just your control arms, that gives you more clearance in the center. It also has durability issues off-road. Like I already mentioned, your tie rod angles, that's going to be difficult to hold in alignment, so that's definitely the weak point. It's also the limiting factor when you get into lift heights. The rear of the Nissan Xterra has a solid axle across the rear frame, and it has leaf springs and shackles that connect that to the frame. Now, a lot of people have a tendency to think about lift kits. Okay, I need a kit and it's going to come with springs and shocks and torsion bars and shackles and whatever else. But I actually like to think of it as a little bit differently. I like to think first, what type of stance do you want as far as your overall vehicle rake? Vehicles come from the factory with a nose down rake. But if you don't want the front of your vehicle lower, then you're going to have to figure out how to lift the front up more than you lift the rear. Now, one of the problems with the Nissan Xterra is that, with the solid axle in the rear, it's very easy to lift the rear of the vehicle cheaply and get a lot of altitude without really running into problems. And so it's easy and common when you just buy a pre-formatted lift. Sometimes the lift on the rear is much higher than the front because you get into binding CV axles or tie rods or something like that on the front end. So you got to know that the front end is going to be the limiting factor unless you get into custom builds and solid axle swaps, which I'll only talk on that very briefly. If you know what you're doing with the solid axle swap, you're probably not watching beginner style YouTube videos like this. So for the front end of the Nissan Xterra, you really only have one decision to make: stock upper control arms or aftermarket lift upper control arms. Now you can adjust the stock torsion bars with the stock upper control arms, and that's fine. And then you don't need to actually purchase any hardware, it's just an adjustment. But if you go into the lift upper control arms, the upper control arms are not actually giving you the lift. They're going to give you a couple benefits though, and one is going to be that you get better articulation and wheel travel because you're replacing the rubber bushings from the stock control arms with urethane bushings that'll have more wheel travel. And it also allows you to get a better alignment when you are lifted with extreme drooped angles on your control arms and your tie rods. Now, of course, being able to hold that alignment is a moot point if you don't have a reinforced steering system. So if you choose to go with the lift upper control arm, you need to make sure that you have a plan for your steering system. As far as the actual products that are out there, I got my lift upper control arms from 4x4parts.com. You can also get them from Calmini, and I think those are really the only two that are out on the market there. So if you're thinking about lifting your first gen Nissan Xterra, that's the first decision you need to make, is either I'm sticking with mostly stock components, I'm not trying to spend a lot of money, and I just want to go with a very small lift, or I want to spend some money on this and turn this into a trail rig, but I don't quite want to go to a full custom solid axle swap, so I'm going to spend money on control arms and a steering kit. That's the decision that needs to be made. And again, you don't need some of the other stuff that would be included in a kit just to get the lift. You can add that later if you want, which is what I did. I started off with control arms and then I added on the front shocks a couple years later. For the rear of the vehicle, since you have that solid axle, you've got a couple different options. Option one, which is my preferred method, is going to be shackle. Option two is going to be an option that I don't necessarily recommend as often, but that's going to be stiffer leaf springs. You can get stiffer leaf springs, which cause basically the leaf springs to not deflect as much under the same amount of weight as the science behind it, right? So it holds the back end of the vehicle up higher because it's stiffer. I don't typically recommend stiffer springs unless you are heavily loading down your Xterra. So for instance, even with stiffer torsion bars in the front end, you don't need them for the lift, but if you have like an off-road bumper and a winch on the front, it might make sense because you have more weight that you're supporting and you want to make sure that you're not getting a lot of motion and bouncing from the front end. Same thing with the rear. If you're constantly loaded down with a lot of gear or you're towing a lot, then it probably makes sense where you could get by with some stiffer leaf springs, but it does stiffen up the suspension and makes it harder to articulate. So you got to kind of choose between a softer flexible suspension or a high load capacity suspension. So those are really only the two options. I will add on a third option that does not apply to the first gen Nissan Xterra, but you might see lift blocks where you have an axle and then you have the leaf springs on top. If you have spring over axle is what it's called. Sometimes you can just get a 2-inch block and you basically have, your axle and your leaf spring and then you put a block and it's just like a spacer. It just spaces it upward. Personally, I think that's kind of a goofy way of lifting. I don't like that method, so I would not necessarily recommend that on other vehicles. But again, the Nissan Xterra has springed under axle, so that's irrelevant for this conversation. But if you do see those out there, they will not work. So let's dig in a little bit deeper on shackles versus leaf springs, because this is where you can start to get into some more combinations. You have a generic lift shackle that you can get, which is about $65 from 4x4parts.com. Calmini also has one that's at a comparable price. They advertise around 1.5 inches of lift. That's very cheap and it's very easy to go ahead and lift up the rear of the vehicle, that 1.5 inches. That's usually paired with just adjusting the stock suspension and not doing any actual hardware improvements in the front. You can also get a lift shackle that's called the adjustable shackle. That's actually what I have on my truck. The overall shackle is actually quite long. It gives you about 2 1/8 inch of lift when you're at the maximum height setting, but it's got multiple sets of holes drilled into it. So that way, if you're dissatisfied with the amount of lift, as far as you have too much lift or you want to lower it down some, you can pick a different hole. Now the downsides of that is that it'll probably look goofy having some extra bit of metal shackle hanging down below your leaf spring. Potentially could get caught up on rocks or logs off-road. I never had a problem with that when I first installed it. I basically got those shackles first, and I did a stock adjustment with the upper control arms in the front, and then once I added the full lift upper control arms, then I raised it to the tallest setting, and that worked out really well for me. You can also get a different shackle called the revolver shackle. Those are more expensive. That's like in the $200 to $300 range. I don't remember the exact price. You can get those at 4x4parts.com. Those advertise at around 2 inches of lift. And this is actually like a double hinged joint. And that gives you some amount of lift, but it's designed to, I guess, not do a whole lot of lift, but it unhinges itself during axle articulation. So if you get off camber and you really need that axle flex, you can get some pretty extreme flex in that. It's more pricey, but that is an option if you have the money and you feel like that extra flex would really help you out. Now for the rear axle, it's an open differential, right? So in order for the rear tires to push you forward, you have to have both tires on the ground, so extra flex does help you in that scenario. So those are kind of the main types of shackles that you can get. And then you go on to leaf springs. There's a couple different types of leaf springs. 4x4 Parts has a single leaf pack where it's one leaf spring that you add to your existing leaf pack. That adds stiffness and it gives it about 3 inches maybe. You'd have to go check the specs. I never got those leaf springs, so I'm just going from memory here. Now in general, if you add one stiff leaf, it's going to make the ride a bit harsher. A leaf pack is going to be more flexible and better ride quality essentially if you have multiple thin leaves that are kind of like interwoven together, so that way you get like a progressive stiffness. If you don't want to get the single leaf pack because you're concerned about ride quality, you can go with the 3-leaf add-a-leaf pack. You can add those 3 leaves in with your existing leaf pack, I believe is how that works, is that it's in addition to your existing leaf pack. And that can give you about 3 inches of lift as well, but since it's 3 individual leaves, it gives you a bit of a softer ride. I believe Calmini also has a single leaf spring that only adds 1.5 inches. So as I mentioned, how do you piece together and get a lift kit that you like? Well, start off with, again, your ride height. Measure your ride height at the horizontal seam that's parallel to your floorboards. Most vehicles have a nose down rake, so say you have a 2-inch rake where your nose is 2 inches lower. Well, I don't necessarily like that, but I'd be happy with like a 1-inch rake. So I want to lift my front end 1 inch higher than my rear end. And so that's how I got with the 3-inch upper control arms in the front, and then basically the 2-inch maximum height adjustable lift shackle in the rear. So lift 3 in the front, 2 in the rear, and that gives you about a 1-inch rake, and that way you're not overlifting the rear and having a severe nose down rake. That's the direction that I went. A lot of the kits out there pair a leaf spring that is going to give you like 3 inches with the revolver shackle, which could give you an extra 2 inches on top of that, and then control arms on the front. And then you see a lot of trucks out there where you end up with a severe nose down rake, and then people end up removing random leaf from their leaf packs and random springs here to try and lower the rear end of the truck down some. So I recommend starting with where do you want your rake to be, and then what do you need to lift? What combinations can you pick and choose and go together? Like I said, the front you have one decision, that's control arms or stock control arms. On the rear, you need to figure out, okay, do I want to do just a regular old lift shackle? Do I want to do a revolver shackle with a stock leaf pack? Do I tow a lot and do I need a stiffer leaf pack? Those are all decisions that you can make, but these are the basics of lift kits on the Nissan Xterra. And the one thing that I will touch on is if you are really into off-roading and you really want to build a super customizable big lifted Nissan Xterra, then you go with a solid axle swap. And that's basically where you cut off all the bracketry and all that junk on the front end, front differential, CV axles and everything, and you're going to source a solid axle from a mid-80s Jeep Wagoneer that has a Dana 44. I think it's high pinion and driver's side drop on where the differential is, and that'll line up with essentially where your drive shaft would come out of the transfer case. That is a huge expense because you're looking at getting an axle, you're looking at refurbishing an old axle, you're looking at welding new brackets and gusseting onto it. Now, if you don't want to do a custom build, Cal Mini also has a solid axle swap kit that includes a lot of brackets, so you can bolt it on and then attach the axle, but you would still need to do custom welding on the axle, so there's still a big job. It's also expensive, but that's how you can get coil springs in the front, that's how you can get coilovers, you can get really flexible front articulation there, and it's also a big durability upgrade if you're planning on doing some serious trail riding. So if you have a clue about solid axle swaps, I'm assuming you don't really need this information from me. If you're very resourceful, you can go junkyard diving, and if you got your own welder and you want to fab something up, but by that point you're really getting into a very customized, custom built suspension and off-road truck. So that's 99% of Xterra owners are not looking at doing that, but that is out there just for your awareness. So thanks for sticking around for this nice long rambling video. I just wanted to put this information out there. I know as a new Nissan Xterra owner, it can be difficult, especially if you're not familiar with suspension systems on vehicles, to understand really what do you need. I want to lift my truck, but I don't really know anything at all about it. So this is the basics of suspension lifts. There's a lot of different combinations that you can do out there. You don't necessarily need the $1,000 kit, but there is some cheaper ways that you can go about it, but you need to decide up front what direction you want to do, because it might be more expensive to undo the work that you do first. So thanks for watching, and comment below if you have questions or suggestions about specific suspension setups, and let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos.